So you found the skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. When last we left off, Timothy Cleary was lying to Trey and by extension the rest of the internet about erosion on Hawaii and pretending that for some reason all the Hawaiian islands should be gone. He's going to continue with that. He also got done dismissing the rather obvious idea that hard capstones can protect underlying rock from erosion, and that so can soil coverings that themselves are held in place by plants. Basically, it's just been a denial of really basic aspects of reality, and it's not about to stop here, so without further ado, here's Tim and Trey.
1 million years is all you need.
Yeah.
To them, that's nothing.
I mean, if we're still talking about Hawaii, 1 million years is longer than any of them have been eroding on net, so yeah, it's a big deal.
And so why are there islands? Because that would be 76 miles of erosion in 1 million years. That's, again, 5 inches a year doesn't seem like a lot, but...
We still have them because in the past they were bigger, and now they're smaller, except for the ones that are still growing. Those used to be smaller. That's it. It's that simple.
Multiply it by a lot of zeros and you get a lot of erosion.
Yeah, but that's also true of processes that form new land. You multiply their rates by numbers with lots of zeros and you get a lot of new land. Why is the world not covered in land? Oh, right, because both land growth and erosion, ebb and flow, and on net over long times are roughly balanced.
So you're essentially saying agriculture could be causing higher erosion rates, but it's not enough to make a difference in the time scale.
Not that much. I mean, it's going to erode maybe a little bit, allow water access a little bit easier to some places. It might,
according to some research, increase the erosion rate by a whole order of magnitude. So, no big deal.
Double the erosion rates or something like that. But even then, you're looking at a lot of erosion.
Double is extremely conservative. It's trivial to find studies finding modern economic activity increasing erosion rates by more than twice that factor.
Even if it's 2, you're looking at 35 miles in 1 million years.
Right.
And that's about the islands. So they're...
That right there, where Cleary trails off, is the closest he's managed to get to saying how big he thinks the islands were initially when they started shrinking. About twice as big as they are now. But how does he know that? I think he knows he can't justify that, and that's why he trailed off. You see, I can't see a way in which he is arguing in good faith here. I think he was about to say that that would mean the islands would have to be about twice as big at the start of net erosion, and he also realizes that that's not extraordinary, because it's not.
And if you look at the edges of the islands where they come up out of the water, and the edges where they come up because they make these big shield volcanoes that come out of the ocean, they had to build up, which I believe built up, almost catastrophic eruptions during the flood year and maybe right after the flood. But you're looking at, according to my notes, about 1/3 of a mile in 4,500 years.
Okay.
Okay, so 1/3 of a mile in 400 years to give him the best chance and 5 inches per year. That's 2,000 inches or about 170 feet. Half a mile is 2,640 feet. Is Cleary coming up with a new erosion rate? That would require an erosion rate of 82.5 inches per year. That's not quite 2 orders of magnitude, but it's more than the one free one I like to give. What is his justification for increasing the measured erosion rate he already cited by a factor of 16.5?
So you're looking at, it's not that much time. And that's kind of what we see. We don't see a big, huge, just a little remnant sticking up and everything just planed off like you should see if these are millions of years old, maybe just a little speck or nothing left at all.
Okay.
If you understood that, let me know in the comments.
They should just be planed off right below the wave base.
Based on what? Made up new erosion rates and not understanding how island formation works? I mean, yeah, if you get the very basics of how the Hawaiian Islands work wrong, then you will sure come to the conclusion that they aren't actually the way they are. I'm not sure why Cleary considers that a point in his favor.
Which is what a seamount really is.
Right. Okay.
And remember, most of the Hawaiian Islands are indeed gone and are now just seamounts.
So another, I guess, rescue device that I've seen is that...
Remember, rescue device is creationist for reason I'm wrong.
The old rocks that we see were actually shielded by newer rocks.
Yeah, surface erosion tends to only happen at the surface. And all things being equal, higher rocks are newer than lower rocks. Why is he saying this like this very obvious fact is some kind of absurd statement made by an extraterrestrial?
And I guess that implies, volcanic activity, right?
Or sedimentation, that's also a thing that forms new rocks.
Well, or you have to have a lot of deposition. You're looking at rocks that would have to be much, much, much thicker.
Okay.
Than what?
You know, you have to have thousands of feet more sediments that are just gone, and in many cases, no evidence that they were ever there.
I wonder if there's a mechanism that might take sediments and remove them from the crust of the Earth over time. We could call it, like, subduction or something. Oh, wait. Hold on. Subduction! That's already a thing that happens right now, and it removes sediment and rock from the ocean floor. Interesting.
Okay.
Just kind of wiped away. You know, we believe that did happen in the receding phase of the flood, but a lot of times those rocks maybe weren't solid rock at the time, so there was a lot more erosion, I think.
Yeah, that's a good point. After only a year of deposition, most of that sediment wouldn't have had time to lithify. But you see, that poses a problem for the Grand Canyon and just the existence of cliffs. Unlithified sediment is basically mud. How do you make a cliff out of mud? Every cliff requires lithification. So far from a problem for science, cliffs are a problem for young Earth creationism.
Even of the contents as the water was receding. So the water built up, deposited a lot of sediments rapidly. As it eroded and receded, of course, we saw thousands of feet of erosion. Mm-hmm. But again, it's a major catastrophic one-time event where most of that happened.
Yeah, one that's precluded by sedimentation, lithification, the actual erosion present on Earth, the lack of available water, and let's not forget just basic thermodynamics. The flood as conceived by the Institute for Creation Research is physically impossible. The only way to make it work is with essentially infinite miracles. It makes as much sense as saying you can get to the moon by jumping really high on a pogo stick. Or that by mixing the right reagents together, you can turn lead into gold.
It's not been protected for millions and millions of years.
You know, but one other thing I know we've talked about in the past is just like in the studio here, we see these, these big blocks, big bricks. That's what we see. We see layer upon layer upon layer with almost no erosion in between.
Except we do see erosion in between. I've already mentioned the Great Unconformity and Surprise Canyon, but there are other examples. In fact, the Nevada Bureau of Mines and Geology, a part of the government in charge of regulating one of the most important sectors of the Nevada economy, with gold and copper exports being the first and fourth highest valued exports from the state respectively, note that the area around Nevada, Arizona, and southern Arizona is lousy with paleo valleys and paleo canyons. Heck, even if we stick with the Grand Canyon, which is an absurdly convenient place to get pictures of various aspects of geology, since it's basically a slice through the local geology, we get to the nearly completely flat contact between the Coconino Sandstone and the higher Toroweap Formation. Now, you might wonder what the problem there is. After all, sedimentation is generally assumed to be level. And you'd be right, but the problem is that the Coconino is in fact Aeolian sandstone that preserves crossbedding from dunes. Essentially, it's a fossilized dune desert. And you know what the topology of a dune desert isn't? That's right, low relief. It's bumpy. So why is the contact so flat? Well, because the top of the Coconino had to have eroded. Of course, even if we pretend that the sandstone is marine, which I'm sure ICR would like us to do, it still would have had to lithify in order to erode like this under the flood. And as we already heard Clary say, we don't have the time for that to happen during the flood year. And so as the floodwaters receded, this would have been just sand deposition. Of course, there's also the problem that there are limestone formations under the sandstone formations in the Grand Canyon, which is hydrologically impossible in a single flood event. Also, limestone deposits fastest under calm conditions, meaning that it really couldn't form in a flood at all. Never mind underneath larger grain sedimentary rock. I could keep going by listing things like the heat that would be generated by a planet worth of a single year of limestone lithification, the rapid plate tectonics that would cause enough friction to turn the Earth into a ball of plasma brighter than the sun, the lethal megadoses of ionizing radiation that would have to be released to account for all the evident nuclear decay on Earth, etc. Basically, the longer you think about it, the more reasons the flood is impossible you can come up with. It can't explain anything until it's at least plausible, and so far, it's not even close to possible.
Right.
When you're at Grand Canyon, they say that canyon formed, I think the current rate is 6 million years to form that canyon.
There's actually not a great consensus on the exact age of the Grand Canyon, and part of it depends on what incites the original channel. There is in fact some evidence that it might have been the breaking of a prehistoric natural dam that caused a flood spillway that then turned into the river that carved the canyon. But that's only one possibility. No scientist, however, estimates it at less than a few million years old from the time it started being carved to now.
But when you look at the rocks in between some of the layers, there's supposed to be a million years between these two layers and 160 million years between these two layers.
Which, means erosion happened.
And there's no canyons at all.
Right.
You got 160 million years between the red wall and the Muav limestones. 160 million years of time, why is it perfectly flat?
Yeah.
Well, first, yes, there is a paleo canyon cut through by the Grand Canyon. And it's not a secret. They tell you about it at the national park installations dotting the South Rim, at least. I can't say for sure about the North Rim, as I've never been there. But second, that flatness is, at least in some cases, itself impossible apart from erosion. So that flat contact is the evidence of erosion.
Everywhere you look. And those layers
Where'd
go...
that time go?
Yeah, and by the studies I've been doing across the country, those oil wells show that those same layers...
Oil wells that were drilled on the basis of knowing the age of the rocks via radiometric dating, let's remember. If Clary was right, we couldn't have known to drill in those places.
Continue not just in Grand Canyon, they go across the entire 48 states.
Right.
Some of them go up into Canada and down to Mexico.
This is just, why depositional area big? And the answer is because sometimes there have been large depositional areas on Earth. There are big ones now. The Gulf of Mexico and the Sahara Desert come to mind.
And the same layers are found the same way around the world. So we see these flat layers of supposedly millions of years of time between many of them, and there's no evidence of erosion.
Right.
So,
You know, except for those pesky paleo canyons, flat contacts, vastly different depositional environments as you go up the column vertically, etc.
I challenge the deep time people to explain why is there no erosion between all these layers.
Yeah.
Challenge accepted. There is lots of erosion. Next question.
The rescue devices are all fine and good, even if they don't make sense. But
They do make sense. Clary's just lying, and not in some clever way either.
it's still, the evidence shows that that's not the case, regardless. Okay.
Yeah, that's what the evidence shows you if you ignore paleo canyons, ancient planation surfaces, glacial erratics, etc. Of course, the only reason to ignore those is if you're a pseudoscientist who has to cherry-pick data to be seen as having even possible, never mind reasonable ideas.
So there's even some, I guess, logical inconsistencies within the idea of this erosion of deep time.
Even if Clary were right, I don't think I'd describe anything he's put forth as exposing a logical inconsistency with deep time. He's been talking about alleged evidentiary problems. That's not the same thing. A logical inconsistency will be something where an idea is internally contradictory or does not follow. For example, if I said that the flood was so violent as to cause what looked like glacial erratics at the top of the Great Unconformity, and so tranquil as to lay down multiple layers of limestone, that's a logical inconsistency as I stated it. Just pointing out that there's no positive evidence for a global flood isn't a problem with the logic of the flood, but the evidence for it.
One that comes to mind is, we see things like Chimney Rock or other geologic features that seem very, from a geologic standpoint, they seem very fragile.
Okay, but it's less fragile than the surrounding area because of the cap of relatively hard sandstone on top of it, which is why it is protected from erosion. All that's needed for such a formation is for that to be the strongest part in the area, and so it's the last to erode. Is this just another example of why is the present the present? I mean, I can't answer that philosophical question, and I don't even know if I accept either A or B theories of time. I'm not even convinced that the idea of a present is much more than an illusion of my stupid dinosaur brain and your stupid monkey brain. But no matter what, if you look at some formation at a particular time, then that's the time you looked at it in. And there's not really a need to explain why that was the time you made the observation. It just was. It's a brute fact. The formation was bound to exist as it is now at some time. The fact that that time is now isn't really something that demands an explanation.
I think, in my limited knowledge, that if they were that old, they would be, just like the islands, they would be gone already, right?
I mean, sure, Chimney Rock and similar formations like the Pillars of Monument Valley, Arizona, aren't permanent features, but they are bound to exist in some times and places, so finding them where they are now isn't surprising. I really don't understand this argument. It's like saying, if your car runs on gasoline or petrol, then how could it still have any in the tank? It really makes no sense to me, and I don't even understand how it makes sense to Trey. If you get how this makes sense, or you think you do, please let me know in the comments.
Right, like Monument Valley, you see all these little remnants sticking up in places, but most of it's gone. Most of the sandstone in between those little spires sticking up is gone. We believe that's best explained by the receding phase of the flood, where huge, chunks of the sandstone were eroded away by the receding water, but they left a few remnants behind.
Right.
Okay, here's a top-down view of Monument Valley and a top-down view of a flood spillway that's of close to biblical proportion on Mars. One of the things that you might notice is that, on Mars, the formations that were hard enough to survive the flood are mostly craters. They're harder for the simple reason that the impact that created them compressed the rock into itself. On Earth, where there are fewer craters because of greater erosion and plate tectonics, the things that tend to resist floods are just naturally harder rocks, like hard sandstone caps and whatnot. But the thing you can easily see on Mars is that the teardrop shapes where the water couldn't erode a crater give you a clear indication of flow, and the smooth channel lines are characteristic of fast-flowing water. In Monument Valley, we have neither smooth channel lines nor the teardrop shapes around the buttes. There is no reason to think that this was left by runoff from a flood. In fact, the evidence goes against this idea.
And so those few remnants show that there was a lot more sediment there at one point, but it's now gone.
That's true.
But there's always going to be some remnants when water washes off. It's often a little bit here and there. For whatever reason, this area is more resistant to the erosion, or the currents were going a different direction, or kind of swirled around something that protected it. And so you can, just like you get sea cliffs and stuff that eventually do erode away, but you get them temporarily. And that's kind of what Chimney Rock is.
Okay.
A lot of these features are just temporary features that, that would take today's rates of erosion are slower than the floods rates.
Which was very fast.
Right, so they're going slower, but even things like Delicate Arch in Arches National Park, same sort of thing. It looks really delicate because it is, and it's probably going to collapse maybe in our lifetime, maybe your lifetime. But it's going to. Some of these features are going to collapse. And there's a case in my home state of Michigan, the Pictured Rocks National Lakeshore along Lake Superior. And every year, these guys, the boat guys, they used to take tours there with students. And every year, the boat captains would come through and say big chunks of the cliff are missing. There was the winter storms and the ice. But one of the iconic symbols of that park was called Miner's Castle. It was two spires of rock sticking up about 5 or 10 feet. And one spring, one of them just slid into the lake, just cracked off, and there it went. So there's only one spire left, so it's not quite as pretty.
I just let him keep going there because he's right. Those things would take a long time without a flood, and those structures, like basically everything on Earth, are not permanent. And since there is no reason to think a global flood occurred, and nearly infinite reasons to know it did not, he's just listing a bunch of things only explained by real science.
Same thing happened out in Vermont. Didn't one of the faces or something collapse out there near the White Mountains?
That's New Hampshire, not Vermont. They're not the same place.
One of the old man of some old mountain. I forget the name of the rock that was really famous, and it kind of collapsed away. So
it's the Old Man of the Mountain, something I got to see before it collapsed in the mid-2000s, and which we've already talked about.
As you mentioned early on, that's kind of what's happening. We see catastrophic collapses that are more frequent than people think about, because it doesn't happen every year.
Right.
20 years, 30 years down the line. But over centuries, these things are collapsing even before our eyes today. So erosion is pretty fast. I mean, these rates of 40 feet per million years, those are just projected out, assuming conditions don't change too much.
That's true. They are projections, and it's well known that erosion rates are variable. But that's taken into account. But also, again, that the occasional cliff face collapse happens doesn't actually change the long-term erosion rate, because they're calculated with those as a factor. And notice that he hasn't actually disputed that rate in situations other than a global flood. Nothing about this entire podcast has even been an argument. It's incredibly frustrating.
I think they're trying to take into some of the effects of an occasional storms or two that are going to increase the erosional rates.
Yes, they are, because scientists aren't out there worrying about proving deep time or disproving young Earth creationism. They're out there gathering data and making models to predict future data without any particular regard to this very one-sided debate. They take into account as much relevant data as possible, and when they do, they arrive at conclusions that are not just compatible with deep time, but require it. On the other hand, as we've already seen happen a lot in just this short podcast, creationists just ignore huge swaths of the relevant data when they are inconvenient. This podcast has been a prime example of how creationists are not scientists and are solidly in the pseudoscience zone.
But again, it comes back to why don't you see canyons and carved valleys and gullies in between these layers that are deposited?
We fucking do. Paleo canyons are found all over the place. They're not exactly the most common thing, but they're far from unknown. Another group that's not the most common thing are my subscribers, who are exceptional, not common. If you want to be exceptional, why not subscribe? And while you do, feel free to turn on all notifications and like this video so that neither you nor YouTube at large miss another one of my videos.
Really not a lot of evidence of time between most of these layers that should be there if you believe in even this kind of erosion that they come up with.
Except for that economically significant, reliable, and very pesky radiometric dating, right?
John Baumgartner did some calculating. He's a geophysicist, a creation geophysicist.
Yes, he is, and another legit PhD creationist. But then again, let's not forget that Andrew Wakefield also had a real doctorate, so it's not exactly a guarantee of not being a lying piece of shit. And also, Jeffrey Tompkins has a PhD, and he's as dumb as a sack of rocks. So it's not really a guarantee of being intelligent either.
He calculated that you can have tsunami waves that he's modeling can erode material, solid rock, up to 40 feet per day.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Now we just have to find ubiquitous tsunamite corresponding to Noah's flood. Except, wait, we already checked. It doesn't exist. So I'm glad he's having fun playing pretend with his computer. I do that too. But it doesn't mean anything of significance to science any more than the time I programmed a modifier in Blender to create a new star system with planets every time I clicked a certain button. We're just both playing games with our computers that are based on reality to some extent, but don't actually tell us anything about the real world that actually exists.
That's
Erosion,
very fast.
If you have these massive tsunami waves coming in one after the other, one after the other, like he envisions for the flood when you have rapid plate movement going on.
Plate movement that's so rapid that according to ICR themselves, it would generate enough heat to boil the Earth's oceans several times over. Now, I'm not an expert on tsunamis, so I checked with Benthoven, no relation, who is in fact an expert on tsunamis. Just don't tell him that I said that, because he'll probably complain correctly that he's not. But he said that he was pretty sure that if the water is steam, then it couldn't do a tsunami. Further, given how bad the heat problem is, if the water turned to a hydrogen-oxygen plasma, it still can't do a tsunami.
Right.
There are lots of tsunami waves generated. So you can erode really quickly under the right conditions, and you can also deposit very quickly under the right conditions.
Okay.
Well, you can deposit some things quickly under the right conditions, but the smaller the grain size of the sediment is, the worse it is at settling out in turbulent water. This is because the smaller the grains are, the less likely it is that gravity can overcome other forces from the fluid flow. That's why, except in unusual circumstances, which are evident in the rock, things like siltstone, shale, and limestone simply cannot deposit much faster than a few centimeters per millennium. Floods are physically incapable of producing much of the rock that we see because sedimentation rates are more complex than flood caused much erosion, so much sediment deposition. Unga bunga.
Well, before we get to the right conditions, if you will.
That jump scared me. What's next? Y'all gonna have a cat hissing at me from the other side of a medicine cabinet mirror like this is Reanimator or something? Also, if you haven't seen Reanimator, go see it. It's a great horror comedy starring Jeffrey Combs, the greatest Star Trek actor of all time. But watch it after this video, and make sure you like this video. Leave a comment, subscribe, turn on all notifications, share the video, and sign your house and car over to me, your Lord and Savior. Or just do the first 5 of those, that's okay too.
It's time for our random science question of the day. All right, are you ready?
These always worry me.
Okay, good. I like to keep you worried.
I too am worried, but possibly for different reasons than Tim is.
So you mentioned Hutton earlier today, and I think that's a prime example.
Of what? You can't just say prime example and then leave it there. This is like when Clary said that the rock had to be thicker and never told us thicker than what. Creationists, learn how basic language works. Not just English. This is just the very basics of what grammatical categories like comparatives are.
Maybe not so much because he was kind of like one of the first, but when people look at rocks.
So I guess he's a prime example of a geologist, sure.
Why do so many people, I guess people who aren't geologists, the average person, why do rocks appear old?
Because in most cases, the processes that form them are well understood, and because they preclude a recent origin. Further, it's because rocks are relatively unchanging in most cases on the scale of a human lifetime. So for humans, they tend to be static, and we have stories and historical writings about some rocks that go back quite a way with little evident change. As a result of this, coupled with the fact that things like layering indicate evident history, it's obvious that the amount of time covered by this history must be quite a bit longer than even the historical records talking about them. Why
is there this idea that any sort of stone thing that isn't man-made is so ancient?
It's the same reason that you look at a hundreds of meters tall redwood and you realize that it must be ancient as far as trees go. You know how fast rocks can form, at least roughly, and you know how fast trees can grow, at least roughly. There aren't really any options open to us apart from great age, and young Earth geologists are surprisingly reticent to do sedimentation and lithification experiments that could show us even the physical possibility of their proposed absurd rates of sedimentation and lithification. I'm quite curious to see how hundreds of meters of limestone can be deposited in a year and then lithify in time to allow them to become cliffs all during the same year. So far, though, it's all quiet on the research front.
Well, I think a lot of that's a couple of things. Number one, as humans, our short lifespans that we have on Earth, we don't see a lot of change. Most places don't experience major catastrophes, like eruptions at Mount St. Helens. If you're living a long way from that area, your terrain doesn't seem to change. We look back at pictures 100 years ago, they look almost the same. Grand Canyon looks almost the same.
I'm almost impressed this is true. It's pretty obvious, but then again, when has an obvious truth gotten in the way of pseudoscience that doesn't like that truth?
And so we don't see the change in our little temporary lifespan of one human lifespan at all.
That's true.
And we're not experiencing, unless you experience a major catastrophe in that area.
Right.
And secondly, we're somewhat brainwashed by what's taught in the schools, what's taught by geologists, what's been taught since the times of Hutton.
Being taught the overwhelming scientific consensus isn't brainwashing, even if it's not correct. If Clary wants something else taught in school, it's up to him and his colleagues to actually show that their ideas fit the data better. Of course, given that his ideas fit the data about as well as fitting an elephant into a bread box, I'm not going to hold my breath for that. But this is the kind of anti-science nonsense that's the reason I do this. On its own, being wrong about the age of the Earth or how biodiversity arises isn't going to really be a problem for your life or anyone else's. The problem is that conspiracy theories and science denialism result in mindsets where once you accept one pseudoscientific conspiracy theory, you're likely to buy into more. Something Creation Ministries International themselves found out much to their chagrin when they were surprised by the nearly universal anti-mask and anti-vax stance of their fans, despite their encouragement to mask up and get vaccinated at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. They simply couldn't figure out why their audience was rejecting what, according to them, was good science. As if spending decades telling these very same people that science is a big scam full of liars trying to tear them away from the truth of God would have no effect on their broad trust of science, or even science CMI and ICR likes. Pseudoscience, even seemingly harmless pseudoscience, gets people killed. Now, I don't think that the goal of ICR is to create an effectively pro-contagion bunch of acolytes of Papa Nurgle, but that's what they did anyway. This stuff is serious. This is life and death, and not just for the people who swallow this tripe, but for their friends and family, co-workers, and even just the people they encounter in a shop to whom they can spread their diseases. That's why I'm going to ask you again to please share this video and others of mine you might watch. Stopping pseudoscience can save lives, and I've already had enough of contributing to the loss of life in my lifetime. This is me trying to make up for that in whatever way I reasonably can.
That the earth is old, extremely old, too old for the Bible.
The unearthed reading of the Bible is not the only one, nor is it the one that was universally held until Hutton. Most Christians do just fine accepting the truth about the age of the earth. Clary is just needlessly making his religion dumb.
It's billions of years old, like you said, over 4 billion years old.
The fun thing about plurality in English, it covers pretty much any case in which the quantity under discussion is more than 2. So 4 billion years old still counts as billions of years old. I hope that helps. Another fun fact is that some languages have a special form for when you have exactly 2 of something, called the dual number. And rarely we even see a number for when you have 3 of something, called the trio number. Aren't languages fun?
Is the accepted age of the earth. And so you're taught that, these rocks are old, and you go to parks and wherever you go and visit, the signage will always say these rocks are 2.8 billion years old, and these rocks are, millions of years old. Whatever, that's always kind of being thrown out there.
This is the exact same energy as when a flat earther complains that Hollywood is always depicting the Earth as a globe and space as real. Yeah, that's because it is, and basically everyone knows it.
So between not seeing a whole lot of erosion in our short human lifespan, and then the constant bombardment of being told these are millions or billions of years old, everybody gets the idea that rocks are old.
Okay.
Yeah, but the rocks don't tell you time. They're just there.
Yeah, unless you measure their age or actually do some physics to see how fast they can form at a minimum. But, creationists don't like to do that because it shows how absurdly wrong they are. It takes work to be wrong in your age estimates of something by a factor of 750,000. And yet creationists manage to do it all the time. By the way, that's the same kind of error as looking at a 30-year-old person and estimating that they were born a bit less than a minute ago.
You tell us.
They're just there. Well, I tell time because the Bible tells us.
Science relies on empiricism. The Bible isn't evidence of anything in science, and it wouldn't be even if its narrative elements were all literally true. Which they're not. Evidence comes from measurement, observations, and experiment in science. That's not what the Bible is. If the evidence isn't compatible with a person's interpretation of the Bible, then good for them. If it's not, then oh well, their interpretation is wrong or the Bible is wrong. Sorry, but that's just how it is. Physical reality is prior to the Bible, and the Bible is contingent on physical reality. That means that physical reality is the standard to which we must hold the Bible and interpretations of it, not the other way around. In fact, even these Protestants who hold as inviolate dogmas that the scriptures are both the only source of doctrine and that they are perspicuous are just obviously wrong. The many contradictory interpretations of the Bible make this obvious, as do the doctrines they hold to, which are not strictly speaking in the Bible, but are traditions worked out from extra-biblical sources, such as the Trinity, the divinity of Christ, hell is a place of eternal conscious torment, etc. Young Earth creationism is internally contradictory and based on some of the dumbest ideas imaginable about the Bible. It should be rejected by Christians not just for scientific reasons, but also because it's bad theology.
Right.
You know, the Earth is about 6,000 years old, and the flood was about 4,500 years ago. And everything I see in geology fits that.
You know, except for all the low-energy environment depositions, the lack of a worldwide flood layer, the lack of global flood spillways, the lack of evidence of the Earth ever turning into a ball of plasma, the fact that genetics don't line up with a 4,400 year ago bottleneck in all population of land tetrapods, etc., etc., etc. Except for that, yeah, the evidence of the flood is everywhere, just like the evidence for galactic overlord Xenu.
Speaking of then this more biblically grounded worldview, we know that given current erosion rates, just our planet can't be as old as they say it is.
I would love to say that they even argued for that, but they just asserted it. Didn't do any of the groundwork that could even turn it into an argument, and also lied a bunch. This might be the most pathetic outing I've ever seen from a flood geologist, and I've covered mendacious morons like Taz Walker and Andrew Snelling. I don't think Clary is being as obviously dishonest as Snelling, but he's certainly making fewer actual arguments, in that so far he hasn't actually made one. He's just asserted that erosion rates are too high, and done literally nothing to actually establish how high is too high, how big land formations that he says should be gone by now were originally, or even to establish when net erosion began in these places.
So, where does erosion fit when it comes to a biblical time scale? What role does it play in getting the earth to where we see it today?
None. Erosion isn't something that the authors of the Bible really talked about, and they almost certainly didn't have much understanding of it. You might as well ask what the Bible has to say about stellar nucleosynthesis or quantum chromodynamics. It's nothing.
Well, we see the evidence, especially when you look at like air photos and you get up and look at satellite views, you can really see that there's areas of the Earth that have experienced lots of erosion.
This is true, but we can also tell that with a few exceptions, it wasn't flood erosion, because rapidly moving water is pretty well understood in terms of the erosion it causes. Floods cause wide, relatively shallow channels with gently sloped walls. They don't meander, they don't switch back, and they don't leave dendritic arms like we see in most canyons. Further, they deposit graded turbidite, something that is not ubiquitous in the alleged flood deposits. It's hard to imagine how the Earth could look less like it had experienced a global flood than it does.
Yeah, where you can see just materials have been stripped away, and you can almost see the transport directions by where the sediments end up in the oceans.
I mean, yeah, you can. Ocean sediment deposits can in many cases be traced back to the land they came from, so what? That's true under both a worldwide flood and under reality. This isn't a feature we can use to distinguish between Clary's lunacy and real life.
So you can see thick areas in the oceans, with oil well drilling, and tie it into what we can see from looking up kind of the big picture view, the bird's eye view.
Oh yeah, that oil drilling that absolutely depends on our knowledge of the real age of rocks with a high degree of accuracy. Fun.
You can see major areas that eroded and were stripped away, and material was transported.
It's like he doesn't think that science says there has been a lot of erosion. Real geologists are quite aware that the history of Earth has included a heck of a lot of erosion. They see its effects not just in the present, but all over the geological column, and that remains true no matter how many times some LARPer pretending to be a geologist lies about it and says otherwise.
You might not be able to tell the exact time,
Right.
but you can see a common direction, a common buildup. But there's a lot of evidence of massive erosion, which I think most of that took place probably in the receding phase of the flood.
I counter with the equally probable claim that it all happened when the Great Rainbow Unicorn farted a worldwide hurricane that blew away all the sediment.
Okay. So according to, ICR and your view of this progressive flood, it goes up to day 150, it reaches the top, then it starts to recede, and so like during that receding phase is when major erosion takes place.
You know, probably in some places tens of thousands of feet of erosion.
That erosion in many cases couldn't occur in unconsolidated, unlithified sediment. So I would love to see how Clary thinks it is that nearly all of the sediment on Earth lithified over the course of only 150 days. There is sediment that's been accumulating for far longer during historical times which has not lithified. What drove this rapid lithification? Was that yet another miracle? I guess it must have been. But at this point, is the Institute for Creation Research really doing research, or are they just inventing miracles? I mean, obviously that's what they're doing, but it's nice to see an area where it's so obvious.
Especially as the mountains were coming up. And so all those sediments that went over from one side of the Rockies to the other, it might have been 5,000 to 10,000 feet or more of sediment, that was all stripped off. In many places right down to the crust, you know, right down to the crystalline Precambrian rock, we call it in most cases.
Yeah, you heard that right. He thinks that the Rockies didn't exist before the flood and formed in the span of just over a year. I don't even think I need to comment on that.
And so we knew we can actually measure from one side of a mountain to the other, and you can get a pretty good estimate of the same material is probably going over the top or something close to it. And so you can estimate how much erosion. And so there's been a lot of erosion.
I won't dispute that part of it. There sure has been.
In a very short amount of time in terms of the biblical time frame.
Yeah, but it's a way longer time frame if you take the Scientology time frame into account. Of course, you shouldn't really do either, something most Christians know. But
it all seems to be, you know, the best explanation for that would be the flood, the receding phase of the flood.
As a general rule, the best explanation for something is not usually an explanation that's physically impossible. At least not if physically impossible explanations exist.
Because as you mentioned, there is ice and there is air, sort of.
Given that I can breathe, I feel like air existing is a bit more than sort of. There is air sort of sounds more like the exosphere of the moon than Earth.
But the main factor in erosion is water.
In many places, but look at the aforementioned collapse of the Old Man of the Mountain. That was from ice. Look at the deserts around the world, like where Monument Valley is, that also has been already mentioned. At least right now, the erosion is mostly wind erosion. While sure, all things being equal, liquid water is the largest contributor globally to erosion, it's a relatively minor contributor in some environments.
And so if there was, which we believe there was, and the evidence points that direction, if there was a global flood...
which there wasn't.
That would cause the erosion that we see.
No, it would cause extremely different erosion. The erosion that we see can't mostly be caused by flood rocks.
I think most is at the surface anyway today.
Okay.
And the reason there's not much erosion today, it is like 40 feet per million years or whatever the current rate seems to be, is because there isn't a major receding phase. There isn't, the land continents weren't flooded anymore. They've all drained away. So now we just have kind of going back to the normal hydrologic cycle that we see occasional really heavy storms and landslides here and there occasionally.
Yes, the erosion rates are what they are because of the intensity of the causes of erosion over time, Dr. Clary. You get a gold star to take home to Mommy. I'm sure she'll be very proud of you. Maybe she'll even make you some dinosaur-shaped chicken nuggets for being such a good boy. Now tomorrow, we'll go over what a flood is because you still seem to need improvement in that area.
But there's no big major event that's going to really wash away tremendous amounts of rock and material on a regional scale.
Right.
You get some local ones here and there, but there's no activity really that's going to erode away on a regional scale. But even that, like I said earlier, even that slow erosion is too much.
Yeah, he did say that, but I'm getting tired of repeating myself. I'm done with this. He just goes on to lie about uplift not being present in Africa, even though a huge portion of Eastern Africa is currently uplifting, which, is why people in Eastern Africa often dominate races in the Olympics, because they live and train at high elevation, giving them extremely efficient respiratory systems. There's no reason really to go into this, it's just more of the same and some preaching, and then some begging for money. He also seems to think that God decided to create the Grand Canyon to show humans how geology works, which if he did, then he's clearly not trying to get humans to be young earthers, since the canyon provides ample evidence to completely blow a young earth with the global flood out of the water. Either way, that's it. This was barely even an argument despite the fact that it went on for like 40 minutes, much of which I've spared you. If you liked this video, please hit the like button. If you hated it, please hit the dislike button and let me know what the problem was in the comments. Either way, if you're not subscribed, please do so and make sure to turn on all notifications, because if you don't, then subscribing apparently is fictional here on YouTube. Stay safe out there and have a great rest of your day. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Beethoven, Felgevara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, E2V, Strawberry Vein, Denny5252, Aileron Teller, Horseflesh, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostick Van Manen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, Monkey They Them, Sphincter of Doom, and Volus. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.